streaming, and that's good too because that goes out far beyond Zoom, and we want to reach out to people and invite them to come and visit our congregation sometime in the future, and and participate in the Messianic Jewish world and what we're learning. Um, so I'll just remind you where we were. Matthew is explaining to our people, the Jewish people, that the Messiah is Yeshua. That was his whole point in writing his gospel or his biography. And as you recall, that the reason I chose to teach Matthew again is because it's a really great introduction to Messiah and helps us learn a lot more about Yeshua's teaching and his ways and his whole life. So that's why we did that. I finished teaching Galatians and Romans, and then I taught on some of the letters that were written to the Jewish believers, the Messianic Jews of the first century, in Jude and James and First and Second Peter. So I'm glad to teach about Matthew because I particularly enjoy thinking more about the Messiah and what he was all about and what he taught us about. So I always like to come back and teach about Matthew. Well, more recently, last week we learned that Yeshua had some conflict with the Herodians. Those were the Jewish people that kind of followed the Herod, the emperor of Rome. So they were kind of, shall we say, in bed with the Romans. They were still Jews, but they kind of had made some deals with the Romans, and they got some benefits for doing that. So last week we learned about that. We also learned that he had some discussions or maybe debates or maybe disagreements with the Pharisees and the Sadducees that were around him. And it was his life. He was called not just to die for sin, but to straighten everything out. So he took a lot of time in his ministry to teach his own people how to follow God the right way. And of course, the wonderful thing is that through that, non-Jews around the world have learned more about God and how to follow him the right way. So we're really thrilled about that. And although the first 12 apostles that were sent out were Jews, they were sent out to the nations, to the Gentiles. And Yeshua said to them in Matthew 28, which we're coming to in a couple of weeks, make disciples of them. Make disciples of them. So we think at Emmanuel, part of our role is to help fulfill that purpose and help make disciples of many non-Jews who are not yet connected with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in Matthew 23, it begins by telling us that Yeshua addressed a bunch of people, crowds and Talmidim, or students, and there were a lot of questions and a lot of observations that people were making. He starts off in verse 2. He says he acknowledges something. He acknowledges that the position of the Torah teachers, or sometimes called scribes were not just people who wrote Torah scrolls, but scribes were the Torah teachers as well, and the Perushim, or the Pharisees, were worthy of listening to because he says they were in the seat of Moses. So what is the seat of Moses? You might be thinking of it as sort of symbolic, and in some ways it was symbolic, but literally in every synagogue in the Second Temple period, there was carved into the rocks, there was a seat for the head rabbi to sit in. It was called the seat of Moses because the head rabbi was the one who interpreted Moses and made rulings for the people so they could know how to make decisions. They made decisions for the people. They helped the people out by explaining Moses to the people of Israel. Why is Tim so much present in my face there? I like Tim, but okay, there we go. That is a seat of Moses, by the way, folks. Thank you, Carrie. Not that comfortable looking, is it? I'm not sure which synagogue that it's from, but most of them looked like that. When we took our tour last fall, um, we saw a lot of these synagogues, but that is literally the seat of Moses. What it means is the authority of Moses, because God wanted the Pharisees to be. They were descendants of the Mosaic way of looking at things and the traditions that came down through that, the Torah and the oral Torah. So they were given authority among the Jewish people of that day. So they had a literal seat, and you can see it made out of rock or whatever that's made out of, a seat of Moses. So this when the synagogues were built, and here you can see the ruins of one of the synagogues. There was always a literal seat of Moses, and it was typically in the front of the synagogue. The synagogue in those days was called Beit Knesset, or the House of Assembly. Our building is called the Gathering Place. Technically, it is Beit Knesset. It's the gathering place where we gather. And we see that the seat of Moses, or the seat of Moshe, is there. And from that seat, the rabbi would make rulings for the people and help interpret what they had to say. So he goes on to establish their authority by saying, whatever they tell you, take care to do it. In other words, trust what they say. Trust how they interpret the Torah. However, he adds, don't do what they do, because they talk but don't act. Now, that's of course called hypocrisy, and we know that we're all capable of being hypocritical. We all like to come off so spiritual, and sometimes we're not quite that spiritual. This is all about that. Some of us may not like the teachings of Yeshua in this section, because he really is nailing all of us for our attitudes, our behavior, and sort of causing us to check ourselves out. So there was nothing wrong with these customs, like having the seat of Moses. Nothing wrong with that at all. But it's a question of how these are used. And we're going to go to the next custom. He talks about tzitziot, or fringes. These are the strings that hang down from a tallis. I'm going to show you mine. This is my summer tallis. I wear it a lot because it's cool. And there's quite a lot of tradition. You can see there's knots in there, and they're tied a certain way because they stand for something. They stand for the laws of the Torah. But it was a very important thing to do, is that the rabbis taught their people if they would wear the fringes, it would keep them focused on God. That's the reason for wearing the fringes. Now, in ancient times, fringes were really worn on the four corners of the garments of the men, because men wore like parkas or ponchos that had four corners, and on each corner was to be a little tassel of strings, and they were to be they symbolized the Torah, and so that's why it was so important. But a lot of people had kind of gotten overboard and were not handling this the right way. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So he says in verse 4, the problem was the Pharisees they may have had the authority of the seat of Moses, but in verse 4 he says they tie heavy loads onto people's shoulders, but they won't lift a finger to help them. In other words, listen to what they teach you, but don't follow what they do, because they're not the right kind of people. So he uses a rabbinic hyperbole, if you will, speaking about how a person could be burdened down with a huge pack on his shoulders, and the religious leaders would stand by and watch. Now, I want to tell you that was not the case of all the religious leaders, but some definitely that was the case, and we have to guard against being like that. We need to remember that we are saved by grace, and only saved by grace, and go from there and follow a true spiritual life. And he goes on a little further. He says, not only do they tie heavy loads on people, but won't lift a finger to help them, but everything they do is to be seen by other people. In other words, they are a little bit in the show-offy world. Now, one of the things they say is that he accuses them of making broad their phylacteries. I don't know if you know what phylacteries are, or tefillin is really what the Hebrew word is. this is my set of phylacteries, my tefillin. One is for the head and one is for the arm. Um, I'll go into that some other time, but you can see maybe on this, if you can look closely, if I can get this in front of you, the Hebrew letter Shin is on the front of the phylactery there. You can see the Hebrew letter Shin, and that stands for Shomer Daltot Yisrael, means watchman over Israel. So that's why the letter Shin was put there. And inside the phylacteries are the Shema and some of the other blessings that God asked the people of Israel to recite. If you have a complete Jewish study Bible on page 1426, there's a nice little article called "The Relevance of Phylacteries to the New Testament." So I encourage you to read it. We won't have time to read it this morning, but if you have the complete Jewish study Bible, go ahead and read that section on tefillin. Tefillin is a Hebrew word for phylacteries. What people were doing to show off, instead of the nice little boxes like I have here, they were making big boxes and they were wearing them, and by doing so, trying to look extra spiritual. That was the problem, even though internally they were not, as we're going to find out. So they made their tefillin, their phylacteries, larger. Not only that, their tzitziot, that's these things, these fringes, they were making them extra long, like down to the ground. And that also was sort of an attempt to show how spiritual they were, but inside they were not. And many of them were very spiritual. I don't want to knock them at all. The Jewish people, even though they didn't trust Yeshua, most of them were actually really good people. They were raised studying the Torah, learning the Torah. And what happened, some of the rabbis got out of hand and were going too far. And that's often the problem. Religious leaders can often go too far because they have a certain amount of power or authority. So you have to be careful of that. So the message here about tefillin and about tzitziot, or the fringes, is it's okay to use Jewish customs. I'm telling you that. It's all a good thing. I want you to use them if you want, but not abuse those customs. I remember being in a conference once, and I saw some young people. They were not Jewish, but they were non-Jews who were getting involved in Messianic Judaism, and literally, their fringes were dragging on the ground. I thought that was obnoxious. I think maybe they were doing what Yeshua was criticizing some of the leaders of his day for doing. He goes on to say that they love the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues. Now, it's true that they did enjoy that honor because they deserved it. They were trained people. They were given authority. It's like respecting the police, which this country needs to be thinking about doing. Right now, it looks like a lot of people are making moves to disrespect the police. And God help this country if all these governments decide to, instead of developing better policemen and better community relations, use the money for something else. It could be a disaster. So he said that there is another issue that was happening. They loved to be greeted deferentially by being called rabbi. Now I want to comment on that because I know some of you have trouble calling me rabbi because you read this verse, but I think I need to unpack this verse for you. The Hebrew word rabbi is really ravi, meaning my great one. The word rav in Hebrew means great. And what was happening in these days is that there was a problem because some of the spiritual leaders had become puffed up by having this term rabbi, or great one. And so Yeshua had to deal with that. Remember, he's on his way to Jerusalem to die for sins of his people, but he's kind of doing some last-minute teaching that was really needed to be done at this time. So the word rabbi, as I said, ravi, means great one. It doesn't just mean teacher, although all the ravim were teachers. And the problem was that some of these rabbis were overhyping their position. In other words, they were misusing their position of servant, as a rabbi should be a servant to his community by teaching them, by helping them understand God's word, by explaining Torah to them. That's really the role of a rabbi. So he said, and he's speaking to the crowd, he said, not to let themselves be called rabbis, because you only have one rabbi. Remember, he's not talking to rabbis per se, he's talking to the crowd, that they should not let themselves fall into that problem, because they needed to learn how to have humility, be humble. So the term my great one is actually technically the meaning of that, but it's not meant to be used in a condescending way. It's not a supercilious way, is the term I should have said. So a good rabbi, and I hope I am one myself, has a sense of sharing with other people what I know from what God has given to me, not lording it over people. And apparently that was an issue in those days. It still happens today. We see this in synagogues where some rabbis are, not many, but some rabbis overdo their authority and misuse their authority. We see this in the Catholic Church where some priests have gone way beyond what they're allowed to do, and we know all about that. And we see this in Protestant churches as well. Sometimes people can just go overboard with their authority, and Yeshua is challenging them and the crowds to not let that happen. So everybody is more humble. He even goes on to refer that, he says, don't let any man call you Av or Father. But that wasn't even an issue in those days, because it wasn't wrong to call your father, Father. The problem is with the term rabbi and father is that he wanted everybody to remember that there's only one rabbi, meaning God. He is the great one. And when we say the word rabbi, we should be thinking about God. It's my title. It's my title. Like if I was a medical doctor, it's important that you would call me doctor. It shows respect for the many years of medical school I've gone through. And that's the way we have to look at the term rabbi. It doesn't mean great one. It's just a term that we use today. So he said that there should only be one leader as well. In verse 10, he said you should only have one leader. And we use the term zakanim or elder in our congregation. And that's okay to use the term. But we have to remember that really we only have one true leader, and that's Yeshua the Messiah himself. So these are some thoughts to help the people kind of get a perspective on things, because the goal of this teaching, now he's turning to the people that were following him, is that the greatest among you must be your servant. So if you want to be great in the kingdom of God, my friends, if you want to be a congregational leader, if you aspire to be an elder, as it speaks about, it's a good thing. Paul writes, if you want to be an elder, that's a good thing. I think it was Paul. And it's important to remember, though, to be a true leader means to be a true servant. In our congregation, I'm always pleased to see people who are appointed to the role of leader actually showing humility. No elder should be lording it over anybody else, but should be humbled. For Yeshua says in verse 12, whoever promotes himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be promoted. So we don't like to promote anybody to the position of elder or even shamash or deacon unless they show humility. Because what happens is they get puffed up. It's happened before at our congregation. We will not let anybody be in that position unless they show true humility. Excuse me again. I have to drink out of my cup that says rabbi on it, because somebody gave this to me. And I like it because I feel when I use the term rabbi with regard to Emmanuel, it makes me feel good, because it helps me remember that my role here is not as your great one, but as your servant and as your teacher. Excuse me. So this whole first section that we just kind of went through was Yeshua challenging and confronting some of the attitudes of the Parashim, the Pharisees, that they had gotten way away from what God had intended. Again, why is he doing this? He's heading towards Jerusalem. He's heading towards the end of his life, and he feels compelled to leave some important teachings for his people to follow. So I want to read one other section about this call no man rabbi section because I think it's important. This is also from the Complete Jewish Study Bible on page 1427. It was written by a friend of mine, Rabbi David Friedman. He said, when Yeshua told his Talmidim not to let themselves be called rabbi, he was not actually referring to rabbis, or even the term rabbi, but rather to a self-satisfied attitude. In other words, he says, one could paraphrase this verse by saying, don't call yourself any name, including Father, that arrogantly indicates that you are above someone else. And that's the problem. If you call yourself rabbi, or even if you accept being called rabbi, the potential for elevating yourself is there. Or to even be called Father, it's a similar way. It's a similar situation. So the whole purpose here of this section is humility. This article goes on to say, moreover, wait a minute. The main point of his teaching is in verse 12, the specific terms that Jewish and Christian leaders call themselves, whether rabbi or nasi, which means prophet, or pastor, or priest, or doctor, elder. Any of these terms are there's no problem with that. But the gist of the lesson is that people have to be humble. Somebody might be given the title of a doctor, and I'm sure you've been to doctors where you feel that they don't have a sense of what you're going through. They just go through what they go through. They went to medical school for 28 years or whatever number that is. And I have found sometimes doctors to be a little bit difficult to deal with because they're not as humble as I would like them to be. The doctors that I've enjoyed really show humility and caring for me, not just come in, get your shot, whatever, and move on. They show humility. So here Yeshua is saying, he's not saying that an ordained teacher shouldn't take on the title of the role rabbi. He was saying not to separate from one's constituency in an arrogant way, or your students, but to lump all Jewish scholars who use the title rabbi throughout history, including today, is into the category of those whom Yeshua was referring to, would be an interpretation of the context of that verse. So I'll tell you now, for those of you who have been uncomfortable calling me rabbi, relax. It's not what Yeshua was talking about. It's just my title at Emmanuel. And it's not meant to be my great one. And I know that you don't mean it that way. I know nobody at Emmanuel sees me that way. But as your teacher, as your servant, to explain the Torah to you, that's perfect use of the term. Now, in verses 13 through 36, we have another issue. First, he talked about the attitudes of some of the Perushim, the Pharisees, and now he's focusing sort of on the practices of the Perushim and how they need to be dealt with. The Perushim were high-profile leaders in those days, and their offenses were really bothersome because everybody looked at them as the ones to follow, and consequently, there were godless Pharisees. Some of them were, no doubt that there were some that were godless, some were not the way they needed to be. But you have Nicodemus, you have Gamaliel, you have Paul, Shaul. They were all Pharisees. Doesn't mean they were Pharisaical. Pharisaical means that they are legalistic, meaning that you think that you are saved by following the Torah, and then as a result of that, you lord it over other people. That's what Pharisaic means. It's an adjective. But the Pharisees were a good group of people. In fact, I will maintain that Yeshua, who was raised in the world of the Pharisees, he himself was a Pharisee most of his life. But we have to be careful here because this expression about Pharisees has also been used in a anti-Semitic way, because this section that we're coming to now I call them the woes or the oys of the Pharisees. Now let me stop myself right now, because the word oy is actually Hebrew. I guess you didn't know that. It's also used in Yiddish. That's why it doesn't sound quite like Hebrew, because the way I say oy, it has a Yiddish feel to it. I say oy when I see something good happen. I see oy when I stand up these days. Oy, you know what I'm saying. when or when something bad happens, oy 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 vey. These are Yiddish words, but they come out of Hebrew. And uh, right now we're going to study some of the oys or woes on the people of Yeshua's generation, the Pharisees in Yeshua's generation. But before we do that, I want to remind you that Matthew 23 and these oys or woes there is very much like the prophet Isaiah said on the people of Israel. Particularly in Isaiah 1, there's quite a lot of criticism of the people of Israel by Isaiah the prophet. What we're seeing here is that Yeshua, because he had to get things straightened out, because he knew that his life was short, at least before his return, which then will be really long, he had to make a confrontation of the Pharisees to get things kind of squared away before he went to Jerusalem to atone for our sins. And I want to mention to you, first of all, that in the Talmud, in Tractate Sotah, which is one of these sections of the Talmud, which is a large compendium of books, there's a whole tractate on the types of Pharisees that existed in Yeshua's days. And I'm not going to take the time to go through them all, but I'll give you an example. There was one, they accused this Pharisee of being a stumbling Pharisee. Now, what does a stumbling? These are Pharisees writing about their own people, so it was self-critical. We have to be careful when we criticize people, but these were the Pharisees that were writing the Mishnah and the Gemara, and they had a term for one particular type of Pharisee, and here's what it was. You get a kick out of this. It was called the stumbling Pharisee, or the nikpi. This was a Pharisee who walked in an exaggerated manner to draw attention to how humble he was. In other words, he would look like he was stumbling all the time, and it was deliberately done so that he looked helpless, and that was criticized by some of the Pharisees. Another kind of Pharisee that they criticized was the bleeding Pharisee. That's because he had a problem looking at other women, and he was always bleeding because he bruised himself by walking into walls. It's kind of funny, isn't it? But this is the way the Pharisees dealt with each other. They had a sense of humor, but this is the way that they confronted one another. There were 7 descriptions of the Pharisees in this section. The one that was called the pestle, like a mortar and pestle, Medukiah, was the Pharisee who publicized his own holiness by always walking with his head bowed, like a pestle and a mortar. In other words, he always kept his head bowed to kind of tell everybody, hey, I'm really spiritual. I'm really spiritual. Look at me. And that's not the way it was meant to be. And then there was the last one. I'm just mentioning 3 out of the 7. The Mi Yeraha, the fearful Pharisee. This is a person whose relationship was based on God out of absolute fear, not on reverence. When we hear the word fearing God and being a God-fearer, it did not mean that you continually are trembling before God, although that is reasonable, but that you have a reverence for God, a respect for God. So in Matthew 23, kind of we see the same thing happening, because we're going to get to the woes that Yeshua is uttering forth towards some of the Pharisees of his day. But I wanted to set this up first, that these criticisms of Yeshua towards the Pharisee was not uncommon. The prophets of old were harsh on the people on the leadership of Israel. Not the Am Haaretz, not the people of the land, but mostly the religious leaders. Isaiah and the other prophets, many of them were very harsh on the people of Israel, because they had a high expectation of the leadership of Israel, so they got criticized a lot. So here we're seeing Yeshua criticizing the Pharisees of his day. And I'm going to say that in most translations, the word that we see here is woe, or woe to you, but it really is woe. The word woe is a translation, not a translation. A translation of the word oy. I know that sounds silly because it's Yiddish, but in in Hebrew, you can spell it O-Y if you want, Oy, but it means woe. So the first woe in verse 13 is directed to what he called hypocritical teachers and Pharisee who obstruct others from the kingdom of heaven. In other words, these people, they're being chastised by Yeshua. Again, he was a Pharisee, he was chastising his own family, basically. How could they be obstructing others from the kingdom of heaven? Weren't they concerned about people getting into the kingdom of heaven? Sure they were. Yes, definitely, that was their goal. The word perishim, though, creates a problem because the word perishim comes from the Hebrew word parush, and the word parush means separatist. So a person who was a separatist could get a pretty good attitude about other people. They were so pure that they couldn't deal with the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. So they were elevating themselves above the people of the land, and that was not what Yeshua wanted to see happen. So they were zealously following the Torah, but they even put a fence around the Torah. You've heard me use that expression before, like a fence around the Torah. So around the laws of the Torah were a lot of other instructions that kind of, it was a hedge around the law, a fence around the law that if you were maintaining, if you were not breaking the outside laws, the fence around the law, it would be unlikely you would break the kernel of the truth of the law. So this fence around the law, though, became dominant, and the extra commandments ended up being entered into the Mishnah, which was the first part of the Talmud. What happened was that the rabbis wrote laws, extra biblical laws, for the purpose of helping their people follow the biblical laws. I believe it was well-meaning, but as we've read many times in the New Testament, Yeshua criticized some of this extra biblical law-keeping that people were actually focusing on more of the traditions that were developed by the Pharisees than the truth that was given by God through Moses. So he said that these people that were focusing on these extra biblical things were actually causing many people, to not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's a big oy. Not only that, some of them were praying at great length and showing a lot of zeal for God, but really it was a lot of showing off is what was happening, to be honest with you. The second oy we're going to look at, although there is in many of the early translations, there's a verse 14 that is not in the complete Jewish study Bible or the complete Jewish Bible. If you look at that, you can see the number 14 with an asterisk. At the bottom of the page of that asterisk, it says, some manuscripts include verse 14, which says, woe to you hypocritical Torah teachers and Parashim, for you swallow up widows' houses while making a show of praying or davening at great length. Because of this, your punishment will be all the worse. In other words, it was another woe. It's not in many of the more recent texts, but the early text had that at verse 14, another woe because of the way people were. They were just some of the leaders were showing off and davening or praying extensively. You would think they were spiritual giants, but they were not, because they were stealing people's houses. Okay, so now we'll go to verse 15. And this is where Yeshua shares his warning against hypocritical leaders who go to great lengths to make one proselyte. Okay, what's the problem with that? Now, we in modern century, in the 21st century, we modern Jews, 20th, 20th century, we don't see much proselytizing by Jewish people. I want to explain this. Over the years, because the church has sent missionaries out to convert Jews or proselytize Jews, and as often has not been handled that well, there's sort of a tacit agreement that if you don't proselytize us, the Jewish people say, then we won't proselytize you. So it's kind of an unpleasant deal. I don't like it too much, because I really think that God wants us that are Messianic people to be proselytizing or spreading the message of Messianic Judaism far and wide, because I think we're obliged to not only bring our Jewish people to the Messiah, if you call that proselytizing, okay, but we're also called to bring non-Jews to the God of Israel through Torah and teaching the ways of God to the Gentiles. So I think proselytizing is a good thing. However, in the first century, it was done. So it was also done in the first century, but there were some problems with it because it was being misused. I don't have time to go into that anymore, but it said some of these people were actually making their proselytes twice as fit for Gehinnom as they were, because they were heaping way too many rules and regulations upon them. So the third the third woe, is a rebuke of the spiritual blindness of the Torah teachers and the Pharisees. Let me read that to you. It starts with verse 16 and goes through verse 22. I'm not going to read all of that, but I'm going to start with verse 16 so you know what we're saying here. Verse 16 says, "Woe to you, blind guides! You say if someone swears by the temple, he is not bound by his oath. But if he swears by the gold in the temple, he is bound. You blind fools!" Can you imagine Yeshua talking to the people this way? I mean, we've learned that Yeshua is pretty direct with his fellow Jews, and I think we have to remember that it's okay to be honest and direct. I don't know that I would be quite that direct, because he was God incarnate, so he could get away with that, but he ultimately didn't, as we know. Excuse me. So these are some examples of what people were doing with regard to oaths, taking oaths. And you blind fools, which is more important, the gold or the temple, which makes the gold holy? And you say if someone swears by the altar, he is bound. Blind men, which is more important, the sacrifice or the altar which makes the sacrifice holy? And so someone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it, and someone who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who lives on it, and someone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. But as we know from other places, Yeshua said, don't swear by anything. Just let your yes be yes and your no, no. This whole business about making oaths, although it's okay to do it if it's something that you sincerely feel led to do, but the message is keep your oaths if you're going to do them. But he's really kind of saying, let's stay away from oaths unless they're sincerely made. An oath can be good, because if it's done right, it kind of makes us committed to it. I sort of took an oath to myself to try to lose weight, and it's working, but it's very difficult. And if I fail losing weight, that's why I didn't make a promise to God, because I don't think I have the discipline to do that. But I did make sort of a subtle oath to myself and to my wife Lisa, and I try to do it, and I'm making progress. But you know what I'm saying. It ain't that easy. The fourth woe, is directed to the Torah teachers and the Pharisees again, and exposes some of their misplaced priorities. He says they pay their tithes, their 10%, which is commending them for paying their tithes, and that was something incumbent upon every Jew. Tithing is very part of the Torah, part of the teachings of the rabbis. Tithing means 10%ing, or giving 10%. Tithe is a word that comes from the King James Version. It means tenth. So every Jew is required to give a tenth of his earnings or his increase to the temple. And I told you before that in biblical times, when you add all the tithes up, the required tithes, I think it's something like 23%. So in a way, 10% is the least of our tithes. But here, he's saying to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're really good at that. It says they tithe their spices, their mint, their dill, and their cumin. In other words, they're so effective, they're so disciplined. They tithe even the little spices that they get. But he said but they've missed the weightier things of the law, the weighty matters of the Torah. They should have attended to them. Really, it's good that you can do the tithes. It really is, and I encourage it. I think it's a requirement, and I think it's a blessing to you as well as to everybody else. But beyond that, we need to remember to follow the most important, weightier matters of the law, which is more than tithing dill, mint, and cumin. what are the weightier matters of the law? Yeshua tells us justice, mercy, and faith. Those are the weightier matters of the law. That's what we have to keep in mind. Now, there's nothing wrong with tithing and making sure you do tithe, but it's also important to try to focus on the weightier matters of the law, because that's really what tithing is all about. It's to cause us to be more connected to the law, the Torah itself. Now I'm going to stop there because I want to explain that one more, a little bit more next week, and I want to finish this chapter next week because the end of this chapter has something that's really heartbreaking that I want to share with you, particularly for a Jew like myself. So read through Matthew 23. We'll get through it next week, and we'll keep on pressing on. I'm delighted to share Matthew again because for me, I know it helps me get to know who Yeshua is and what he was like even better than I do, having walked with him since 1973. But it's good to refresh who I'm walking with, and I hope all of you feel the same way. So now we're going to stop and go back to the regular service, and we'll pick up on this. Don't forget, at 1 o'clock, we're going to regather for a bit of a discussion about the benediction. And on Tuesday night, we have our book study. We're going to start a new book this week because we just finished restoring the Jewishness of the Gospel last Tuesday. The new book is called Holy Cow! Does God Really Care What We Eat? It's a new book we're publishing. It's really a fun book. The writer's really delightful to read, and it makes some very, very important points. So don't forget that, and don't forget to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and don't forget to pray for our country more than ever before. We are in a very dangerous place, I believe. All right, I'll turn it back over to Carrie and Steve.
We begin with the great Kaddish. May his great name be magnified and sanctified in the world, that he will create anew, when he will raise the dead and give them eternal life, will rebuild the city of Jerusalem and establish his temple in the middle of it, and will uproot all pagan worship from the earth and restore the worship of the true God. May the Holy One, blessed be he, reign in his sovereignty and majesty during your lifetime, and during the lifetime of all the house of Israel, speedily, soon, and say, Amen. Yeshme Rabba Mevora, Alamo Meomaya, Let his great name be blessed forever and for all eternity. Blessed, praised, and glorified, exalted, extolled, and honored, magnified and lauded be the name of the Holy One. Blessed be he, though he transcends all blessings and hymns, praises and songs, which are uttered in the world, and say, Amen. May there be great peace from heaven and life for us and for all Israel, and say, Amen. He who makes peace in his heavenly realms, may he make peace for us and for all Israel, and say, Amen. So say Shalom. hear Misha Barrick's healing prayer. Once again, if you have prayer requests, please use the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Type in your prayer requests, and we will get those to the appropriate people. Please join me in praying for our congregation, our nation, and Israel. Lord, hear all of our prayers and grant peace, goodness, blessing, grace, kindness, and mercy upon us and upon all Israel, your people. Bless us, our Father, all of us as one with the light of your face. For in the light of your face you gave to us, Lord our God, the Torah of life and love and kindness and righteousness, blessing and mercy, and life and peace. May it be good in your eyes to bless your people Israel at all times and in all years with your peace. Blessed are you, O Lord, who blesses your people Israel with peace. Shomer Israel, Shemor Sha'arit Israel, Ve'ah Yuvad Israel, Ha'omrim Shema Israel. O guardian of Israel, preserve the remnant of Israel. Let them not perish, your people Israel, who affirm, Hear, O Israel, for our country. Now more than ever, we lift up all of our elected and appointed officials. We pray that you would speak to each with your still small voice, so our leaders would make decisions based on your wisdom, not their own. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. Rabbi, did you have any other announcements?
I want to reinforce what I said, that at 1 o'clock we're going to regather here online like this, and have a little chat about the Aaronic benediction and anything else you want to talk about, and we'll have a little prayer at the end of that. I saw that there was quite a few people this morning. I'm glad to see that. New people I think, that I haven't met before. Maybe I haven't met. I'm not sure, but good to see new people. Don't forget, Tuesday night we're going to start a new book study. You'll love it. It's quite funny, and it's quite interesting and educational as well. Let's see. I had a note here. What else did I want to say? Oh yeah, I expect that we'll be getting back into the building pretty soon, folks. So we're going to send out a survey probably this week, and get your input on going back to the building for services. I believe that our county, Howard County, is allowing groups to get together if they don't use up over half the space with people, which we won't be doing. I hope someday that's a problem, but it isn't right now. And we'll be able to handle it very wisely with social distancing and masks maybe and all that sort of stuff. That we'll send out a survey and get your take on that. So look for that. And I'd like to welcome all the new people and look forward to meeting you face to face, panim al panim, or face to face. Maybe with masks, maybe without masks, who knows? But we're good, and I think things are going great. I'm glad the congregation is staying together and growing even during this pandemic, and I'm thankful to God for that fact. So have a good lunch, everybody, and I'll see you at 1 o'clock, and we'll continue with a Zoom discussion, over Zoom. So enjoy your lunch, and I'll see you soon.
We'll close with the Aaronic benediction. Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha.
Ken Yehi Ratzon.
Adonai panav elecha yifunecha.
Ken Yehi Ratzon.
Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom.
Ken Yehi Ratzon. The Lord bless you, and you know what that means now. The Lord give you abundance in every aspect of your life, whatever that may be. Maybe children, maybe you want a lot of children, maybe health, maybe you want a lot of health. Whatever the way God can bless you, may He bless you, and may He keep you. That means protect you, provide protection for you economically, obviously physically, that you might be safe, and may the Lord make His face shine upon you. That means be happy with you, have a good relationship with you, and that's largely determined by ourselves. And may He be gracious and kind to you, which is obviously He has been providing the Messiah for us. And may He lift up His countenance upon us, meaning may He smile upon us, and may He give you peace. Shalom. In the name of Yeshua, the Prince of Peace. Amen and shalom.
Okay, if you would unmute yourselves and greet everybody.
I'll see all the kids at 12:15. I'm gonna go run and have a quick lunch.
Hey, does that include me?
It's your kid at heart, sure. Hi, Gary Whitfield. We see you. Well, we see your text.
Shalom, everybody. Shalom. Shalom.
Shalom. Shalom. Shalom.
See you at 1 o'clock.
This is a very old Paul Wilbur when he was a young guy. He looks a lot older now.
A great song to dance to.
It is. That's at a Messiah conference, I think, although I'm not sure.
It's live in Jerusalem.
Oh, okay. It wasn't a. Yeah, wow. Got a big crowd there.
Yeah.
Very good, Noel. Very good. Very good. Come on, let's go outside.